You create an idea of the world that makes you feel comfortable and safe. My idea of Thatcher was that she was the embodiment of evil. So that's why it's strange to have those easily held convictions challenged, to have those foundations undermined by actually meeting the person and realizing they're all too human.
A new show's come out, Brian and Maggie on Channel 4. We have done Margaret Thatcher before, so before people accuse us of running out of content, we can assure you that that's not going to happen. Sometimes I worry, but
Yeah, we got hundreds of
thousands.
thousands of subjects to cover. I'm a huge fan of Steve Coogan, as you know, so obviously I watch everything that he does. This is about a famous interview that Brian Walden did with Baroness Thatcher. I don't know if she wasn't a baroness back then. It was kind of pivotal because she went from being the Iron Lady, that kind of white van man and lots besides really loved, to being sort of seen as slightly off her trolley. And this interview sort of kind of brought an end to her kind of glorious reign. After watching it, I was sort of intrigued because I saw Bernard Ingham, and then I remembered that I'd photographed him, and he was a precursor to Alistair Campbell, who kind of rebranded the Labour Party as New Labour. He's depicted in Brian and Maggie, and at the time it was important for me because it was one of these trade magazines. I was just starting out, and he was well known.
Yeah.
And we should mention that shoot because when you're a photographer, you're working and you're photographing ordinary people, you know, perfect. No one's better than anybody else, but you're photographing people that aren't in the public eye. And then suddenly, every now and then, they throw you somebody that is slightly in the public eye. And you realize that if you can get a good picture of them, potentially you can put it in your portfolio and you can get more interesting people to photograph.
It's like a stepping stone.
Absolutely, a stepping stone. And that's why it's really important to think about your career in the long term, not just your approach and the way that you take pictures, but your subject matter and whether it's going to be adding to your body of work.
So on to Thatcher.
What I would say is that in the era of the selfie, let's talk about selfies, no self-respecting professional photographer would ever take a selfie with their subjects. It's a kind of ludicrous thing. It's so unprofessional. But in this case, I just couldn't resist it because she'd loomed so large in my political awakening. When I was a kid, my parents, you know, were kind of telling me about politics and all the kind of male, pale and stale kind of predecessors of Thatcher, you know, were a bit boring. And then suddenly this kind of colourful, cartoonish character comes onto the scene, and she's potentially the first female prime minister. And my mum, I don't think she ever used the feminist word, but she regarded herself as women's liberation, women's lib. And I remember her being very excited at the prospect of the first female prime minister.
Love her or hate her,
Yeah.
she's
And my mum
pretty
died
powerful.
last year, so I think we should put a photograph of her.
Yeah, I'll throw
Because
her
she
up.
was a formidable woman, you know, not unlike Thatcher in some ways. She definitely ran the
Comparing your mum to
household.
Thatcher.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think she was a Thatcherite, but she was a formidable woman and absolutely part of who I am. I mean, I didn't think I would get the opportunity, and then suddenly it came. I mean, there was an excitement in the agency that I was part of, IPG. You get to hear what other photographers are working on, and it's quite, you know, it's quite competitive. You know, we'd all be kind of doing our stuff. And I'm sure that there would have been a bit of a buzz. One of the other photographers was doing one of the other subjects for this Time magazine piece that I was contributing to. So it was great, heroic or villainous figures, I'll leave you to decide which category Thatcher falls into, of the last century. And so they were doing an extraordinary portfolio of people: Nelson Mandela, Gorbachev, and Tom Stoddart, who is a friend, is no longer with us. Brilliant, brilliant photographer. Check his stuff out if you get the opportunity. He was doing Gorbachev and I was doing Thatcher. Unlike a lot of my shoots, which are in East London, I had to find somewhere near her home. And I ended up using this place called the Lemonade Factory in Battersea. And the only time I've been back there since was when I did Bob Geldof. he spoke very fondly of her, and he sort of said that they maintained a friendship, and they would sort of talk about what it was like in the
Oh
80s
yeah,
and
she
stuff.
used to call him up in the middle of the night or something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
or vice versa.
yeah, that was it.
It was at this studio, I don't want to do it down, but it wasn't the most glamorous studio that you'd have a previous prime minister. You know, it was a bit sort of shabby, but it was a great location, had lots of possibilities. I was just pleased to get her there. Before we did the shoot, there was police, there was kind of undercover officers. We had to submit all the people who were going to be there. So there was Chris, my assistant, there was Seamus, my agent. Suddenly everyone wanted to come along.
Of course.
Julius from Time magazine, and then hair and makeup, and so on and so forth. And so there was a huge call sheet, and all those names had to be put into a computer just to check that no one was going to suddenly pull out a knife.
Yeah, they were probably thoroughly background checked, I can imagine.
Exactly. So when we started, you know, I was so nervous, so keen to get something in the bag, that I used this little Sunpack battery-powered ring flash, which I put on my shooting on a Canon digital SLR, which was actually a great advantage because I was able to get a lot. Because the interesting thing is that from the beginning of the formal shoot until the end, the metadata tells me that I only got 12 minutes. So I had to work very quickly and be very clear and assertive to ensure that I got my pictures. But she was great. She was very professional, and I think she kind of enjoyed the whole process.
Yeah, and that 12-minute includes all the pictures of her just in hair and makeup as well.
Yeah, I mean,
so you probably only got 5 minutes of
yes,
actual shooting.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I will have to check that actually.
Yeah, we'll check it.
But I do think the pictures that I took when she's getting ready are really interesting, because it shows her kind of putting on the clothes of becoming this kind of brand, this Iron Lady. You know, she had her handbag, and so I photographed her holding her handbag, and you know, she had these bright clothes that were kind of like, you know, very, very different to the grey suits of Westminster.
Like royal purple, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And it was really a question of utilising all the different available images that I could within that kind of the architectural elements of the studio. So I was using daylight, I was using flash, I set up a backdrop, you know, I had reportage when she was getting ready. And, you know, I really got a comprehensive, you know, wide gamut of imagery, which is what you want. You know, that's what Time magazine are going to be pleased with.
Definitely. So I remember you've mentioned before her skin. You were surprised by how smooth her skin was.
Yeah, it was like alabaster. She was like a porcelain doll. She obviously had her own person who knew what she liked, and she had a lot of powder, a lot more powder than was probably necessary. But it was kind of like her war paint. It was kind of like a mask. And interestingly, the picture that didn't get used is the shot I took with her eyes closed, which is the kind of iconic picture, which is like a death mask.
Yeah. So I remember you actually talking about that. You were on TV. You were on The Greatest Shot, weren't you?
Yeah.
And you speak specifically about that
Yeah,
picture.
I mean, it ended up becoming quite a definitive picture, which is what you want. And it was used everywhere. After she died, you know, it got a lot of syndication, you know. But the picture that Time used was much more of a conventional portrait, probably one of the pictures I liked least from the set.
Okay, and I might just quickly clip to The Greatest Shot, you talking about that particular picture.
Sometimes you can get something great in 12 minutes. I really kind of scrutinize people's faces when I'm sort of making an edit. So there are actually 6 frames where she had her eyes closed, but they're basically all the same picture. Quite often the first picture and the last picture have the most sort of energy, but there's really nothing in it. So forget about the technical considerations and sort of just go for that emotional response. And you can see that that picture that I took has something. I think there's a tension there, something around the eyes, and also a sort of vulnerability. It was very strange. At the end of the shoot, Seamus told me that, I mean, normally, as I said, I wouldn't have a selfie with my subjects. But in this case, I thought I'll break that rule. And I suggested to her that we do it, and she was only too happy to oblige. And I sort of put my arm around her, and Seamus told me that the two special branch officers that had been lurking in the shadows, they got up onto their feet, ready to take me down if I tried anything funny.
You reached for the gun or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting when you're photographing somebody like that, of that stature. There's a crazy part of you that sort of thinks, what if I do something a bit mad, like get her in a headlock, then it will be on the newspapers tomorrow. It'll be kind of like a major incident. So, I mean, obviously you're not going to do that. That wouldn't be a good career move.
Yeah.
But it is kind of strange when you're in proximity to somebody that famous, you know.
So in the original video we made for this, you mentioned her succumbing to human frailty.
Yeah.
You said throughout the shoot, she kept asking.
Yeah, it was so poignant. I mean, at the beginning of the shoot, she assumed that I was shooting all these kind of global international figures, you know, like Gorbachev and, you know, Mandela, as though they would be coming to a studio in East London. I mean, it was ridiculous. And so initially I sort of said to her, you know, I was patient, and I sort of said to her, you know, they're going to be shot on another day by other photographers. And then throughout the session, she was asking when the other people were arriving, because she'd sort of forgotten that I'd sort of explained that she'd got her own narrative, and she kind of like was very wedded to it. And then at the end of the shoot, there was a real poignancy, because she said the other people never did come.
Oh.
And yeah, it was so discombobulating, because I had this perception of her, this fierce intellect, you know, this formidable person, and then seeing her vulnerable like that was kind of not what I was expecting. And as I said, it was kind of humbling, because, you know, it's easy to develop a kind of angry, sort of simplistic idea of how someone is, and put them in a box marked, you know, call them a Nazi or whatever, call them something extreme. But life is more complicated than that, you know. She was the product of her environment, her upbringing, and then, you know, in the end, her biological, you know, enfeeblement, you know, that we all kind of inevitably succumb to.
Yeah, even the most hardy.
Yeah, absolutely.